Good day. We are from Group 4 and we will be discussing lessons 15, 16, and 17. The first part we will be discussing is lesson 15, which is gender-based violence, survivor, victim, perpetrator, and human rights. I am Elmi Lagrama Makalala and I will be reporting the first part of lesson 15. So in this lesson, we will discuss about the introduction to gender-based violence, its definition, consequences, the parties involved in it, and the human rights addressing gender-based violence. In this lesson, we are expected to understand the definition of gender-based violence, other related terms and its forms and consequences. Understand gender-based violence as a human rights issue. We should be able to determine the relationship between human rights and gender-based violence and differentiate perpetrators, survivors, and victims in gender-based violence. So we'll start with answering the question, what is gender-based violence? According to our reference book, gender-based violence is any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will that is based on socially ascribed gender differences between males and females. For me, an example of this is sexual harassment. Some perpetrators manggod think na women are weak, so they sexually harass some women because of them being females. Now, some men think that women are inferior to them. I am not saying that sexual harassment only happens to women. Of course, they do happen to men, but not as often as it happens to women. Gender-based violence is also one of the most widespread human rights abuses but least recognized. Ngano kaha? I'm sure all of us have answers to this, but for me, this is because it happens so often that some people think it's normal. Para nako, common issue siya but it can never be normal. Example of this is catcalling. Sexual harassment can also be in a form of catcalling, right? So, kay common naman kaayo, bisan og offended na ang giharas, instead of standing up for herself, mupaspas na lang og lakaw, aron dili na makatcall, and kay also pod nahadlok na. But for those group of men nga ni catcall, normal ra nila kay paastig kunuhay, especially if kauban ng barkada, di ba? They don't recognize or realize that it's already a problem, that it's already an abuse. Also, gender-based violence has devastating consequences not only for the victims but also for the society as a whole. An example of this, in television, we sometimes see news about women being sexually assaulted, some others even killed after they are being sexually abused. So unfortunate happenings like those that I mentioned affect also the society. Of course, the major effects are on the victim, but the community or the society is also affected in a way. How or why is that? Okay, so other women or girls in the society develop fear because of what happened. Like me before the pandemic, no? Before ko na work from home, I had to go to the office to work. My shift is from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Katong paggalat gani sa balita nga naay magpasagad og pangdunggab sa Dumaguete, daghan jud kong absences ato kay even ang paglakaw lang sa kalsada going to my workplace is hadlok jud kayo. So just like that, as a result ato nga scare sa Dumaguete, I feared walking to work at night. Of course, just like me, other people, not only women, feel the same. Instead of coming to work to be productive, some of us preferred only staying home to keep ourselves safe. Big help na unta kayo ang maka-work and it's an opportunity, but others decline the opportunity to work na lang tungod sa kahadlok. So this is how the society is also affected. Finally, gender-based violence is a human rights issue and a development issue as well, with negative consequences for both women and men. So gender-based violence has health, social, and economic consequences. Some health consequences of gender-based violence include unwanted pregnancies, complications from unsafe abortions, sexually transmitted infections like HIV, injuries, mental health and psychological effects. To cite an example, of course, we understand what these are, but just to give an example, for unwanted pregnancy, in those cases, like for sexual harassment or assaults that results to pregnancy, of course, the woman being assaulted did not want to get pregnant with a baby of someone who she did not love, right? She was just forced. So that's a case of unwanted pregnancy. So the social consequences of gender-based violence extend to families and communities. Diba, I mentioned earlier, the society and the community as a whole is also affected, not only the victims and their families. Violence also affects children's survival, development, and school participation. For example, if a child grows in a home where a father is violent and makita gani niya nga ginapasakitan iyang mama, of course the child would grow as kanang murag dili gani socially interactive, kay natingali siya fear nga basig makasala siya, pasakitan siya ging ato, 'di ba? These result to trauma and can of course definitely affect children's survival, development, and also school participation, kay they don't want to interact with other people naman. They get scared and they just don't socially interact with strangers or even with family or friends. They just stop the courage to speak to anyone. The economic consequences of gender-based violence include the cost of public health and social welfare systems. It also reduces the ability of many survivors to participate in social and economic life. 'Di ba? Some of the victims have been really traumatized that they even don't want to go out anymore. How much more socially interact with other people and participate in the economic development of our country, right? Right?
So good day everyone. So my co-reporter just talked about the gender-based violence, which is the lesson 15 that we are going to tackle about for this moment. So for this time, I will be talking about the parties involved with this violence that we have been tackling about. So we have two parties involved. They're just two parties. It is the victims and the perpetrators. But as you can see, I've presented to you three, and we added the survivors. So we're going to define the three of them for you to understand what does it really mean. So first, we have the survivor. They are being described as the defiant. They are strong, they are determined, they are brave, and they conquer what the challenges that they have been through. And then next is the victim. When we talk about victim, they are the prey, they are the martyr one, they are the patsy, they sacrifice a lot. And lastly, we have the perpetrator. When we talk about perpetrator, they are those person who commit the harm. They are those person who commit the murder. They are the assailant. So let's go back. Maybe you have this question. What's the difference between the survivors and the victims? So when we talk about the survivor, it is an empowerment for someone who undergo harm. Survivors are victims, are once a victim, but then they undergo the process of healing. They undergo the process of moving on from the tragedy of their life nga ilahang na experience. So survivor is being labeled to someone for them to really be encouraged nga ni survive ko ani nga pagsulay nga akong naagian, ning survive ko sa rape nga akong naagian, ning survive ko sa harassment nga akong naagian. So they are strong person. They have that determination nga life will just go on even if you experience those. When we talk about victims, it is a definition that is legally defined. It is being used in the criminal justice system. So gamit lang ni siya in the court to refer this person, especially if kanang naana mo sa kaso. So it is being used to define those person who received the harm given by the assailant. So, yeah, wala na sila'y kalahian because a survivor once became a victim. But then, later on, as he continued her life or his life, he continued to move on, he continued the healing process. So, they are labeled as survivors. So, we just need to be careful lang jud sa using those because basin ang uban ma-offend sila because basin dili sila bitaw kanang ganahan i-labeled as victim. Oh, so you can use survivor. You can ask them actually. It is being kanang advice nga. You need to ask them what could be the right label that you are going to refer to them, especially when you are going to talk about their lives or you are going to use them as an empowerment to someone who experienced violence, gender-based violence. So lastly is the perpetrator. So perpetrator, they are this person in authority. They can be an institution who supports, they can be this person in authority who have power, and yeah, they are the murderer. They commit the harm, they abuses those people below them. I mean those people under them, they have the power so they can use it and they abuse it, so they are defined as the perpetrator. So yeah, those are the parties involved when we talk about gender-based violence. So let's continue the discussion. We'll be talking about the human rights. So kanang daghan man tag nahibalaan nga human rights, we can research them and we can read them, but this time I will just be talking about the few that is being violated when someone committed gender-based violence. So let's start. When we talk about human rights, first it's universal, it is inalienable, it is indivisible, interconnected, and interdependent. So that's human rights. So first, we'll be talking the right to life, liberty, and property of person. So of course, if ikaw mahimo kang victim aning gender-based violence, ma-forbidden ka to have a life nga naay liberty, to live a life nga peaceful, to live a life away from harm. So next is the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So being a victim, mawala jud na sa imuha ang right to have that highest attainable standard of physical, kay kanang murag kanang ma-conscious na kasi imong self, especially if you undergo kanang naka-experience ka nga rape ka. So yeah, that's it. Mawala na sa imuha nga kanang the right to have that highest attainable standard of life sa physical and mental health. Daghan na kaayo nga kanang anxiety, depression nga mahitabo ato mga victim. And I tell you, dili lang na sa victim pod, the assailant experienced that as well. Kay ang guilt ana sa ilaha, di na sila mahimutang sa ilang kinabuhi because it is always kanang ilang konsensya ilahang guilty. I hope so every one of those assailant mao na ilang ma-feel to have that guilt nga di sila pakatulugon sa ilang konsensya sa. So next is the right to freedom from torture, of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of punishment. So of course, if violence, when you talk about violence, na dyan na siya mga torture, cruelty, degrading treatment. So maka-experience ta nga bitang maka-receive tag violence, gender-based violence from someone, mawala atong freedom to have a life away from torture or cruel, to have a life nga dili ka humiliate, dili ka have that degrading treatment from someone. So ma-violate na siya. Lastly is the right to freedom of opinion, expression, and education. So mostly sa mga akong nailhan dili tanan, wala na ko siya generalize, pero mostly of those people nga nahimong victim, mawala jud ma-stop jud sila sa ilahang pag-eskwela. Mobalik man sila, pero they will have time for themselves to heal. They will have themselves nga nabitang i-restore sa nila ilahang mag-ready sa sila. So mawala ang ilahang right to have education for that moment kay ma-stop ilahang kanang pag-eskwela. And then expression, when we talk about expression, kanang nabitang mga bata nga kanang i-threaten sila, they don't have the right to express themselves tungod kay naa sila mahadlok sila or kanang naay maghinder sa ilaha, and that's also violence nga kanabitang ma-experience nila from people in authority. So yeah, kanang mo to siya mga human rights nga I don't know if naapay lain, pero as what I've researched nga mo to siya mga some of the human rights nga ma-violate, and daghan pa na siya ma-violate when gender-based violence is being committed by someone. So the survivor and the perpetrator are important actors in the gender-based violence and violence against women. So GBV and VOW are a clear violations of human rights. Gi-violate yun nila ang human rights if someone committed it. And all this point to the essence that these acts of violence are a global and national concern. So I know nga kanang we have peaceful life, but if we encounter kana bitang mga tao nga nahimo silang victim sa gender-based violence or violence against women, may you have that courage or kanang nabitang mo encourage sa ilaha nga yeah, they undergo that kanang tragedy sa ilahang kinabuhi, but it's all in the past. Help them to move on, encourage them nga life will go on bisan pa og mo to nahitabo sa ilahang kinabuhi. They are not kanang tied in their past, but they have future that wait for them. And yeah, hopefully you will be able to be an empowerment nga mahimo pud ka nga encouragement sa mga tawo nga na-experience ani. So that would be all. Thank you and God bless.
Good morning, everyone. Now let us proceed to Lesson 16, still on gender-based violence but focus on power, use of force, and informed consent. The first slide is our table of contents. So here in Lesson 16, we will be talking about power, use of force, and informed consent being the three important concepts in understanding gender-based violence. In addition to that, we will be also talking about the cycle of violence as the starting point of gender-based violence. But before we are going to proceed to our proper discussion, let us first identify our learning objectives. First learning objective is to identify the relationship between abuse of power and gender-based violence. Second learning objective is to understand that the term violence in the context of gender-based violence means using some types of force which may or may not include physical force. And the last learning objective is to understand the meaning of informed consent and its relationship to gender-based violence. So as I have said, there are three important concepts behind gender-based violence. We have power, use of force, and informed consent. So my name is Mayan Maglente and I will be discussing about power. So power refers to the capacity to direct or influence the behaviors of others or the course of events. So by the definition itself, we can say that when someone has power over somebody, he has the authority to direct that person or influence that person. An example of this is an employer-employee relationship. So the employer can direct his employee or influence his employee or make that employee do things on his behalf. Another perfect example is the President of the Philippines. Of course, the President of the Philippines has the power to direct his people or influence his people. So under his leadership, he can either make the Philippines progress or the contrary. Power is directly related to choice. The more power one has, there are more choices available. And the less power one has, fewer choices are available. Let us take, for example, you being a rich person. So you have the money. So you employ a lot of housemaids. By that, you can order those housemaids to do the dishes for you, clean the house for you, or wash the clothes for you. You have many choices available because you are employing them. You have the power over them. The housemaids, on the contrary, has no choice but to obey your order. Why? Because you are paying them and they needed money. So ano na siya? When one has power, one has more choices available. Some examples of power and powerful people. The first one is social power. So when we talk about social power, the first thing that will come into our minds are peer pressure and bullying. Because social relationships, like friendships, nanadira ang social power. Like we gave our friends power over us. So manausahay mabuli ta, or we may experience peer pressure. And then another examples of powerful people that possesses social power are leaders, teachers, and parents. Economic power. The perpetrator controls money or access to goods and services. Examples of these are sellers and manufacturers. Since they have the direct access to goods or services, then makagbuo sila as to the pricing at to the product because sila man ang nagamaad to, or they have the direct access to those goods. And then it sometimes favor the husband or the father. Nga naman ang husband na ay political power. It is because usually man good, it's the father who is working in the family. So, understood man, since the father is the one who is working in the family, so siya ang nag-earn sa money. So, na siya political power as to that money. Kung ihatag ba niya sa iyang asawa, or he can direct his wife as to unsa man ang paliton adto nga kwarta. Or either iyarabang gastuon sa iya ang kaugalingon nga kuan benefit. So here in political power, we do have elected leaders, discriminatory laws, and President of the Philippines. So these people have political power over us because sila man ang nag-govern sa country or sa province or sa municipality. So sila sad ang nag-implement or nagama og mga laws, so they have political power over its people. Physical power. So when we talk about physical power, of course, we have to look on the physical appearance itself. So, magbase ta sa strength, sa size. So, kung kato mga dagko, kato mga kusga, they have physical power. And another example of these is use of weapons or mga controlling access na ginagamit sa mga security, mga soldiers or police, and even robbers and gangs. The fifth one is gender-based violence. So, males are usually in a more powerful position than females. This is especially true sa una, when females are not allowed to participate in politics and mga events in the societies. So, females are just left at home doing household chores, kanang magbantay sa mga bata. But I don't think that this is still applicable in today's generation because nanamtay women empowerment, and I believe that women can do what men are capable of doing. And the last one is age-related power. Often the young and the elderly people have the least power, especially when you are still a child, because people believe that when you are still a child, your opinion matters but not that much because you're still inexperienced and still need to learn a lot of wisdom. This is especially true for elderly people pod since physically dili na kayo sila capable as well as mentally.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Abigail Malababol and I am the second reporter of this lesson, which is lesson 16. And this morning, I'm going to be tackling about the use of force or violence. So let's start. So we have force. Force might be physical, emotional, social, or economic in nature. It may also involve coercion or pressure. So when we say physical, it means that there is any application of force upon or towards the body of another person. Let's say, for example, you bump with another person or you drop an object. That's an example of a physical force. Next is emotional force. So from the word emotion, it means from within or internal. So it's more on how you express your emotion towards a certain situation. You might get angry or aggressive. It all depends on what situation you're in. Next is social. So social forces, these are any human created ways of doing things that could influence, pressure, or force someone to behave and or interact with others. Economic force are the factors that help to determine the competitiveness of the environment in which the firm operates. So those are some of the forces. So force also includes intimidation. So intimidation is kind of an act. So it's kind of you like act tough just to scare the enemies. Next is threats. So threats involves violence, compulsion, or constraint. Threaten to be used by any means upon or against a person. So it involves the use of dangerous instruments or the use of physical force as well. So persecution is it includes the confiscation or the destruction of property. It also involves murder. What else? Execution, torture. So that's persecution, or other forms of psychological or social pressure. Next, we have violence. So violence consists of the use of physical force or other means of coercion, such as threat, inducement, or a promise of a benefit to obtain something from a weaker or more vulnerable person. So all in all, violence is really an extreme form of aggression. So using violence involves forcing someone to do something against his or her will, of course with the use of force. So I guess that's all for my part. So thank you for listening and have a nice day.
Good day, everyone. My report is about informed consent and cycle of violence. Well, informed consent was already reported by the previous group, but let me just expound it as it is one of the two topics assigned to me. Let's start with informed consent. Let's define consent. Consent means permission, an agreement between participants. It makes informed consent means making an informed choice freely and voluntarily as by a person. An informed consent, it's like giving a person or the subject an adequate information, and because of that, he or she is already informed when giving consent. Well, what's the difference between the two? They're both consent, but the other one has information together with it. Tignan ka mag-example. In medical field, for example, nagpa-check up ka. And then of course, the doctor must touch you. And you give him the consent to examine you. On the other hand, sa informed consent, kanang when the doctor said that an operation is necessary to you, then you have to give him the informed consent before the procedures in which you are already informed of the risk that comes along with it. Consent is never implied and cannot be assumed, even in the context of a relationship. An example is, just because you are in a relationship does not mean that you have the permission to have sex with your partner. Communication will always be the key. If consent were disregarded, then gender-based violence will be present because basically, the intruder violated another person's human right. So what's the importance of consent or informed consent? It makes a relationship healthy, in a sense that there is communication, honesty, and respect between the relationship. Asking for the asking Asking for and obtaining consent shows respect for yourself and another person. It eliminates entitlement that one person might feel over the other. These are the things that must be remembered regarding consent. First, sexual consent must be explicit. Consent is never implied and can never be assumed, as what I have said earlier, even in the context of relationship. Just because you are in a relationship doesn't mean that you have the permission to have sex with your partner automatically. The absence of no doesn't mean a yes. That is enthusiastic consent. This newer model of understanding consent that focuses on positive expression of consent, simply put, enthusiastic consent means looking for presence of yes rather than the absence of no. It is necessary to still seek for verbal confirmation. Second, you can always change your mind. Third, it is good to check in with each other. And fourth, drink and drugs affect consent. If you're really drunk or high, you can't give consent. This is because consent must be given freely. If you are intoxicated, your capacity to make decisions can be affected and your decision might be influenced by drug and alcohol. And if you're sexual in any way with someone who's drunk and high and doesn't know what's going on and therefore can't give informed consent, it's equivalent to sexually assaulting or raping them. Fifth, participants must be informed. So, consent is invalid if it is from a coerced person, it is due to fraud, and or it is out of bribery. Minors are unable to give informed consent to certain acts such as marriage and sexual relations because basically they lack enough or adequate information about that thing. So consent is a process. If you want to move to the next level of sexual intimacy, you should ask. So now, let's move on to cycle of violence. Cycle of violence refers to the repeated acts of violence in a relationship. Kabantay mo anang in a relationship na ay bisag ka ng break balik gani. Maybe that relationship is in this cycle. So this cycle of violence has phases. Phase 1, tension building. One feels angry, unfairly treated, hopeless, tensed, afraid, embarrassed, humiliated, disgusted, and or depressed. The abuser is argumentative, uses yelling, criticism, swearing, and ugly gestures. Sometimes, the abuser will use coercion, threats, or minor fights may occur. The tension between the couple gets worse and worse, and the person being abused often feels like bad is going to happen. Victims of abuse during this phase sometimes say they feel like they are walking on eggshells. Phase 2, violent episodes. One feels frightened, trapped, helpless, or numb. As the tension builds, violence is highly likely. The explosion phase. This is when a major act of violence occurs, including physical and or sexual attack and threats to harm, as well as verbal abuse. It is in this phase that injury is most likely to occur or that the police might come. Phase 3, remorseful or honeymoon. One feels relieved, angry over the incident, resentful, guilty, hopeful, in denial over the seriousness of the incident. After the explosion, the abuser feels sorry for the explosion and acts apologetic and loving. The abuser might say things like, "I'll never do it again," "I'm sorry and I never meant to hurt you," "I promise I will change," "I promise I'll get help," "I only did it because I was drunk," "Hi, lost my temper," etc. They may shower gifts on the other person or act like the person you first fall in love with, and things get better for a little while, but the honeymoon doesn't last. The tension starts all over again, and the cycle continues. So those are the three phases of the cycle of violence, and that was all for my report. Informed consent and cycle of violence. The next topic will be reported by the next reporter. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I am Florence Binadal, and we are now in Lesson 17, Women and the Law. In this lesson, we will tackle about various Philippine laws affecting women and their rights. Under this topic, we will discuss the following. First, the 1987 Constitution. Second, various laws promoting gender equality. Third, national programs promulgated to address gender challenges. And fourth, women's right to participate, women's involvement in civil society, and women and education. At the end of this lesson, we are expected to know about the various Philippine laws affecting women. Second, identify the various rights of women. And third, understand the impact of these laws and rights to the Filipino women and the society. But before anything else, let us know the important terms presented in the screen because this will be crucial as we go further in this discussion. So I will start with the 1987 Constitution. I assume that all of you know that this Constitution governed the Philippines and gender equality is a key element of this charter. This is evident in the Article 2, Section 14 of the Constitution, which states that the states recognizes the role of women in nation building and shall ensure the fundamental equality before the law of women and men. Considering the unequal gender relations in the country, the Constitution further provided for women representation as one of the 9 marginalized sectors in the legislature through party list system which should cover 20% of the lower house. Finally, Article 13, Section 14 specifically mentioned that the state shall protect working women by providing safe and healthful working condition, taking into account their maternal function and such facilities and opportunities that will enhance their welfare and enable them to realize their full potential in the service of the nation. These provisions serve as a basis of several legislations about women and thus laws of women became plenty. Next are the various laws promoting gender equality. The legal framework provided by the 1987 Constitution resulted to various legislations promoting gender equality, and we will discuss 9 of them in this lesson. First, the Local Government Code of 1991. So in this code, it provides for the election of sectorial representation, including women in the local legislative council. Second is the party list law, which provides the creation of women-oriented or women-based parties to compete under the party list system. Women is one of the 9 sectors identified by the law. Third is the Labor Code of 1989, which covers issues such as night work prohibition, specifies that employers must provide special facilities for women, prohibition of discrimination against women in respect to terms and conditions of employment, and prohibition of discrimination by reason of marriage of a woman worker. The fourth one is Republic Act 7192, also known as the Women in Nation Building Law, which promotes the integration of women as full and equal partners of men in development and nation building. The law provides that a substantial portion of government resources be utilized to support programs and activities for women. Next is the 1988 Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, which gave Filipino women the right to own land that previously reverted to sons and other male family members. Next is Republic Act 7688, which gives representation to women in Social Security Commission. Next is the Anti-Sexual Harassment Law, or RA 7877. This is an act declaring sexual harassment to be unlawful in employment, education, or training environment. Next is the Republic Act 7822, which is an act that provides assistance to women engaging in micro and cottage business enterprises. And lastly, Republic Act 8353, which is an act expanding the definition of the crime of rape, reclassifying the same as a crime against persons. So the next reporter will discuss the different programs promulgated to address gender challenges.
So good day, and I will be reporting the national programs that was made because of the challenges in gender equality. So the first one is the Philippine Plan for Gender Responsive Development 1995 to 2025. So this program was the fruit of the commitment of the Philippines during the Beijing World Conference on Women on September 4, 1995. This is the overall frame that is also the point of reference for the discussion and monitoring of gender mainstreaming. This plan was also made to pursue and provide the equality and the development for men and women. So gender mainstreaming is the major global strategy for ensuring that the government pursues gender equality in all aspects of the development process to achieve the vision of a gender responsive society where women and men equally contribute to and benefit from the development. So gender mainstreaming is also called gender and development, and this is connected to the second program, which was the GADB, or the Gender and Development Budget. And so the GADB, which prescribes institutionalizing gender concerns in the mainstream development process and agenda, and not just peripheral programs and projects of the government. So this was made to ensure that the government has the means to pursue the GAD strategy. So the next, it also prescribes for the allocation of 5% of the government unit's budget on gender-responsive activities and projects. So the next one is the framework plan for women, or the FPW. This is part of the Philippine Plan for Women Development, and is developed to focus on three thrusts: promoting women's economic empowerment, advance and protect women's human rights, and promote gender and responsive governance. So this plan identifies the concrete gender issues that will be addressed, pinpoint targets and indicators, name programs, formulates the implementation plan, and set up tools for monitoring and evaluation. So, next part is the women's right to participate. So, women's right to vote was granted in 1937. The Constitution of 1935 stipulated that the right of suffrage would be extended to women only if 300,000 women voted in its favor during a national plebiscite. This stipulation consolidated the emerging of women's movement and brought to the fore the activism of women's, namely Concepcion Felix de Calderon, the leader of the Asociación Feminista Filipina, which was founded on June 1905, Rosa Sevilla de Alvaro and Trinidad Almeida, Miss Constancia Poblete, which is the founder of Liga Femenina de la Paz, Pura Villanueva Calao and Paz Mendoza Guazon, Pilar Hidalgo Lim, which is the president of the National Federation of Women's Club, and Josefa Llanes Escoda, president of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines. So the General Council of Women was then established in Manila to direct the publicite campaign. Its aim was to draw support of the broadest number of women. As it turned out, 447,725 women voted yes in the 1937 plebiscite. But surprisingly, 44,307 women voted against the provision. What followed was a colorful history of women's foray into the various levels of electoral victories, but generally pushed by familial affiliation and elite association. At present, women's right to vote and participate are still maintained. So that's all. Thank you, and my co-reporter will continue. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am the last reporter. My name is Hailene Polio, and today I'll be reporting about the women's involvement in the civil society and women and education. So, women's expression of involvement in civil society could be through organizing along gender-specific issues and formation of all women groups with broad coalitions as power-enhancing mechanisms. So, we have women groups such as the Filipino Feminist Movement, the Militant Gabriela Women's Group, the Ugnayan ng Kababaihan sa Politika, the Kilos Cabarro, and the Civil Legislative Network. So these women groups have trailblazed women advocacies both in policies and in legislations. There also exists a so-called Philippine NGO Beijing Scoreboard, which evolved from the National Steering Committee of NGOs for the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, and this led to international monitoring of the government's implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. So along with other women groups and gender-oriented institutions, they have succeeded in raising gender-specific issues such as the domestic violence, sexual harassment and rape, prostitution, and reproductive health. So these gender-specific issues has been discussed already from the previous chapter, which is in lesson which is in lesson 2, under the women empowerment wherein feminism demands equality. So just review, the domestic violence such as the marital rape and physical abuse are often dismissed by society as part of marriage. So although we have the RA 1962 or the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children, our culture dismisses such incidents as away mag-asawa. Next is the sexual harassment and rape. So the Center for Women's Resources is the Philippines estimate that one woman or child is raped every hour, mostly by someone they know. Next, the reproductive health. So this refers to a state of the complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity in all matters relating to the reproductive system and to its functions and processes at all stages of life. So this gives the women the reproductive rights wherein women is in control of her body, and she can decide for herself on what she sees is best for herself. So contraception, abortion, and other reproductive options should be available to women because it is their body. Lastly is the prostitution. So the commercial exchange of sex for money, goods, services, or some other benefits agreed upon by the transacting parties. So the prostitution has been condemned as a single form of human right abuse and can attack on the dignity and worth of the human beings. So by the intense lobbying efforts by the women's group, it resulted in the passage of several landmark laws. Among them is the Anti-Sexual Harassment Law in 1995 and the Anti-Rape Act in 1997. The gains of the women's movement are basically achieved through various partnerships in the rest of the civil society. Next is the women and education. The Philippine educational system is a combination of the public, private, and private institutions with the state providing free education for elementary and secondary levels. The Constitution provides that without limiting the natural rights of parents to rear their children, elementary education is compulsory for all children of school age. So there is no generally discrimination of girls in education. Thus, there is no marked differences existing in the educational status of Filipino women and men. One glaring issue is the gender stereotyping of fields of study and specialization, and its onward translation into the world of work, where men generally occupy the highest occupational ranks and the highest paying positions, whereas women's larger responsibility for housework and for the family impeds their ability to use their educational training and skills for remunerative work. So this topic previously discussed are always timely, relevant, and part and parcel of the daily lives of the Filipinos. This only shows the degree of importance that must be given to this topic. In Lesson 18, there are plenty laws on Filipino women. So from the fundamental law of the land up to the existing legislations. So it can be projected that more such legislations shall arise in the future. These laws are essential as they can be springboards of various national programs, women involvement, participation, and inclusion, all towards the highest goal of empowering women. That's the end of my report. Thank you guys for listening.